The warehouse falls silent as Antonio Salvatore, 58, the most feared mafia boss in Chicago, stares down at the small girl who wandered into his private meeting. Blood still stains his knuckles from the interrogation that was interrupted. His men shift nervously, waiting for their boss to explode at this impossible breach of security. "Have you seen my puppy?" 6-year-old Lucia asks, clutching a torn leash, tears streaming down her dirt-covered cheeks. The room holds its breath. Everyone knows Salvatore's reputation. 30 years of violence, countless enemies who disappeared without a trace. Children mean nothing to men like him. They're collateral damage in a world built on fear and respect earned through brutality. But something flickers behind Salvatore's cold eyes as he kneels to the child's level. His voice gentler than anyone has ever heard. What could a hardened killer possibly say that would change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Antonio Salvatore's fingers found the rosary beads hidden beneath his shirt, a habit from childhood that survived 30 years of blood and betrayal. The warehouse on Chicago's South Side had witnessed more confessions than most churches, though none of them involved seeking forgiveness. Tonight's interrogation of Tommy Ricci had been going well until this impossible interruption. The child stood in the center of the circle, surrounded by men whose combined body count exceeded the population of small towns. Marco Benedetti, Antonio's right hand for 15 years, reached slowly for his concealed weapon, awaiting orders that never came. Instead, Antonio remained frozen, studying the girl's face as if seeing something that shouldn't exist in his world. "Boss?" Marco's voice carried the weight of confusion. In 3 decades of service, he'd never seen Antonio hesitate when security was breached. The Salvatore organization controlled 70% of Chicago's waterfront, laundered money through 14 legitimate businesses, and maintained corrupt relationships with 37 city officials. Antonio had built this empire through calculated violence and strategic elimination of obstacles. Witnesses didn't survive encounters with his inner circle. Children especially didn't wander into secure locations and live to discuss what they'd seen, yet here stood this girl, impossibly small, against the backdrop of industrial brutality that defined Antonio's existence. Her clothes were torn, dirt streaked her cheeks, and the leash in her hands told a story that made hardened criminals uncomfortable. Someone's beloved pet was missing. Someone's family was probably searching frantically through neighborhoods that didn't welcome strangers asking questions. The rosary beads pressed against Antonio's chest, each bead a reminder of Maria Salvatore, the woman who raised him before cancer took her when he was 16. She'd insisted on Sunday Mass, evening prayers, and the belief that every soul could find redemption, regardless of the sins that stained their conscience. Antonio had abandoned those beliefs the night he killed his first man, but muscle memory preserved habits that rational thought had discarded. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Antonio's voice surprised everyone, including himself. The gentleness felt foreign, rusty from disuse. "Lucia," she whispered, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Lucia Martelli." The surname hit Antonio like physical impact. Martelli. He'd ordered the elimination of the Martelli family 3 days ago, a message to rival organizations about the consequences of encroaching on Salvatore territory. Vincent Torino had been moving product through the North Side using independent contractors who didn't understand territorial boundaries. The Martellis had been intermediaries, facilitating connections that threatened Antonio's monopoly on waterfront distribution. Standard business practice. Eliminate threats, maintain control, preserve profit margins that funded the lifestyle Antonio's organization had grown accustomed to enjoying. The Martellis were collateral damage in a larger strategic operation designed to consolidate power and discourage future challenges to established authority. But looking at Lucia's tear-streaked face, Antonio couldn't reconcile the strategic necessity with the human cost. This child had family members who'd been executed because of decisions he'd made in rooms like this one, surrounded by men who followed orders without questioning moral implications. Her parents were probably among the bodies currently feeding fish in Lake Michigan. The warehouse felt colder suddenly, industrial heating inadequate against the chill that had nothing to do with October weather. Antonio's men watched their boss struggle with emotions they'd never seen him display. Confusion replacing the confident brutality that had defined their working relationship for years. Tommy Ricci, bound to a chair in the corner, used the distraction to test his restraints. Blood from his broken nose had dried across his shirt, evidence of persuasion techniques that usually produced reliable information about rival organization activities. Tonight's session had been interrupted before reaching its logical conclusion, leaving questions unanswered and debts unpaid. But Antonio couldn't focus on business concerns while this child stood before him, living proof that his actions had consequences extending beyond strategic calculations. Lucia Martelli represented innocence destroyed by choices he'd made without considering collateral damage beyond immediate operational requirements. The rosary beads grew warm against his skin, heated by proximity to a heart that hadn't felt genuine emotion in decades. Maria Salvatore's voice echoed across years of accumulated sin, reminding him that every action carried moral weight regardless of strategic justification. Some prices couldn't be calculated using profit and loss statements. Marco stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper that wouldn't carry beyond Antonio's hearing. "Boss, we need to handle this situation. The girl's seen too much." Antonio nodded slowly, understanding the logical necessity while feeling something inside him rebel against the practical solution. In his world, witnesses disappeared. Problems were eliminated efficiently. Complications were resolved through methods that didn't leave loose ends threatening organizational security. But Lucia's eyes held trust that Antonio hadn't seen directed toward him in 30 years of commanding. Fear and respect through violence. She looked at him as if he might actually help find her missing puppy, as if kindness still existed in a man who'd forgotten what mercy felt like. Lucia's small fingers worked at the metal clasp of a dog collar that hung from her torn leash. The nameplate scratched but still readable. Benny, 1247 Oakwood Street. The address meant nothing to Antonio's men, but it told him everything he needed to know about the scope of his organization's recent operation. "Tell me about your puppy," Antonio said, settling onto a wooden crate to bring himself closer to the child's eye level. His knees protested the movement, joints stiff from years of violence and stress that aged men faster than time alone. Lucia's voice barely rose above a whisper, each word punctuated by tears that had been falling for hours. "Benny's a golden retriever. He's only 2 years old, but he's really smart. Mama taught him to sit and stay and come when you call his name." She clutched the collar tighter. "He was sleeping in my room when the bad men came." The timeline crystallized in Antonio's mind with sickening clarity. Tuesday night, 11:47 p.m. 4 men had entered the Martelli residence through the back door while the family slept. Professional execution, no witnesses, bodies removed before dawn. Standard procedure designed to send messages without creating crime scenes that attracted unwanted police attention. But somewhere in that efficient operation, details had been overlooked. A child had hidden, a dog had escaped, loose ends that violated every protocol Antonio's organization followed when eliminating threats to their business interests. "Where were you when this happened?" he asked gently. "Under my bed. Mama always told me to hide there if strangers came to the house." Lucia's grip on the collar whitened her knuckles. "I heard Daddy yelling, then everything got quiet. I stayed hidden until morning, but when I came out, everyone was gone. Even Benny." Marco shifted uncomfortably behind Antonio, recognizing the operational failure that had allowed a witness to survive. Clean eliminations meant no survivors, no evidence, no complications that could threaten organizational security. The crew responsible for the Martelli job had violated fundamental protocols by failing to conduct thorough searches of the property. "Did you see the men who took your family?" Lucia nodded, her description matching the four-man team Antonio had personally selected for the operation. Vincent Torino's muscle had been encroaching on Salvatore territory for months, using independent contractors to move product through waterfront facilities that belonged to Antonio's organization. The Martellis had been facilitating those connections, earning commissions that rightfully belonged to Salvatore associates. Standard business practice required decisive responses to territorial violations. Competitors needed to understand that Antonio's organization wouldn't tolerate encroachment on established revenue streams. The Martelli elimination had been designed to discourage future challenges while removing immediate threats to operational security. But listening to Lucia describe her family's last moments, Antonio couldn't maintain the emotional distance that made such decisions possible. Her father had tried to protect them. Her mother had hidden her daughter under the bed, knowing she couldn't save herself, but hoping to preserve at least one life from the violence that was consuming their home. The rosary beads beneath Antonio's shirt seemed to burn against his skin, heated by proximity to guilt he hadn't felt in decades. Maria Salvatore had raised him to believe that every life held sacred value, that violence should never be the first solution to human conflicts. Those lessons had been buried beneath 30 years of strategic necessity and competitive pressure that demanded increasingly brutal responses to business challenges. "The men who came to your house," Antonio said carefully, "did they say anything about your dog?" One of them laughed when Benny barked. "He said dogs make good target practice." Lucia's tears flowed faster. "I think they took him to hurt him." The casual cruelty described matched the psychological profiles of men Antonio employed for enforcement operations. Professionals who enjoyed their work, soldiers who found satisfaction in causing fear and pain beyond what strategic necessity required. He'd always considered their enthusiasm an asset, proof of loyalty and commitment to organizational objectives. Now their sadism felt like a reflection of his own moral decay, evidence of how far he'd traveled from the principles Maria Salvatore had tried to instill in the boy who'd once served as an altar boy at St. Anthony's Cathedral. That child had believed in protecting the innocent, defending those who couldn't defend themselves, using strength to shelter the vulnerable rather than exploit them. "We're going to find Benny," Antonio heard himself say, the promise emerging before conscious thought could prevent it. Marco's expression conveyed disbelief mixed with professional concern. Antonio Salvatore didn't make promises to witnesses. He eliminated complications that threatened operational security. The logical response to this situation involved permanent solutions that prevented future problems, not quixotic quests to rescue animals that had probably been killed already. But looking at Lucia's face, watching hope replace despair in eyes that still trusted adults to keep their word, Antonio felt something shift inside his chest. The rosary beads pressed against his heart, each bead a reminder that redemption remained possible even for souls stained with decades of accumulated sin. Antonio's hand trembled as he opened the desk drawer in his office, revealing a small pink elephant that had belonged to his daughter Isabella. 23 years had passed since the car accident that took her life, but the stuffed animal still smelled faintly of the lavender perfume she'd worn to her high school graduation. He'd been planning to attend that ceremony, had even bought a new suit for the occasion, but business had interfered, as it always did. "Boss, what are your orders regarding the situation?" Marco stood in the doorway, his professional demeanor masking deep concern about Antonio's unprecedented behavior. In 15 years of loyal service, he'd never seen his boss show mercy to potential witnesses, especially ones connected to recent elimination operations. Antonio closed the drawer without removing the elephant, but its presence lingered in his memory like an accusation. Isabella would have been 29 now, possibly married, maybe with children of her own. She'd wanted to study veterinary medicine, had volunteered at animal shelters throughout high school, believed that protecting innocent creatures was humanity's most important responsibility. "We're going to help her find the dog," Antonio said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument, despite the apparent insanity of the decision. "Sir, with respect, that's not how we handle witnesses to organizational activities. The girl's seen our faces, knows our location, could identify personnel involved in sensitive operations." Marco's loyalty compelled him to voice objections, even when disagreeing with direct orders carried professional risks. Lucia sat on the warehouse floor, carefully arranging the torn leash into neat coils, while humming a melody that reminded Antonio of lullabies Maria Salvatore had sung during his childhood. The innocence of her actions contrasted sharply with the industrial brutality that surrounded her, a living reminder that gentleness could survive even in environments designed to destroy it. "The Torino organization took her dog," Antonio explained, though he recognized that explanation didn't address Marco's legitimate concerns about operational security. "They killed her family, destroyed her home, stole the only thing she had left. That requires a response." Marco processed this information with the tactical awareness that made him invaluable as Antonio's second-in-command. Vincent Torino's crew had been increasingly aggressive in their territorial expansion, using independent contractors to move product through waterfront facilities that belonged to Salvatore operations. The Martelli elimination had been designed to discourage such encroachment, but apparently the message hadn't been received clearly enough. "We could handle the Torino problem through conventional channels," Marco suggested carefully. "Professional resolution that addresses territorial violations without involving civilian complications." But Antonio wasn't thinking about territorial disputes or conventional solutions. He was remembering Isabella's voice on the phone the night she died, excited about a stray cat she'd found near campus, making plans to adopt the animal despite dormitory regulations that prohibited pets. She believed that protecting helpless creatures was more important than following rules created by people who didn't understand compassion. "This isn't about territory," Antonio said. "This is about making something right that we made wrong." The admission hung in the air between them, acknowledgement of moral responsibility that violated every principle Antonio's organization operated under. Professional criminals didn't accept blame for collateral damage. Strategic necessities sometimes required civilian casualties, but successful organizations learned to compartmentalize such costs rather than allowing guilt to compromise future decision-making. Lucia looked up from her careful arrangement of the leash, eyes still red from crying, but brightening with hope that adults she trusted would help solve her problem. "Do you really think we can find Benny?" "Yes," Antonio answered without hesitation, the promise emerging from depths of his personality that had been buried for decades beneath layers of strategic brutality and emotional armor designed to protect against exactly this kind of vulnerability. Marco watched his boss kneel beside the child, speaking in tones reserved for conversations with people who mattered personally rather than professionally. Antonio Salvatore had built his reputation on emotional detachment, the ability to make ruthless decisions without being influenced by sentiment or compassion that could weaken resolve when strength was required. But this child had somehow penetrated defenses that 30 years of violence hadn't been able to destroy completely. Isabella's memory lived in that pink elephant, in the belief that protecting innocence was more important than maintaining power, in the recognition that some debts couldn't be paid through conventional business practices. "Sir," Marco said quietly, "the other families will see this as weakness. Showing mercy to witnesses, involving ourselves in civilian concerns that don't advance organizational interests. They'll interpret compassion as vulnerability, use it to justify challenges to your authority." Antonio understood the political implications of his decision, recognized that every choice carried consequences extending beyond immediate circumstances. Reputation was currency in his world, fear was leverage, and any sign of weakness invited challenges from competitors who'd been waiting for opportunities to expand their own territories at Salvatore's expense. But looking at Lucia's face, seeing trust that no adult had shown him in decades, Antonio realized that some prices were worth paying regardless of strategic cost. Isabella's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that protecting the innocent was humanity's highest calling. That strength, without compassion, was just another form of weakness disguised as power. The blood-stained drawing lay crumpled on the kitchen floor of the Martelli house, a child's crayon artwork depicting stick figures labeled Mama, Papa, and Me, standing beside a golden blob that could only be Benny. Lucia picked it up with trembling fingers, smoothing the wrinkles as if she could somehow restore the family it represented. "I drew this last week for Mama's birthday," she whispered, holding the paper against her chest. She put it on the refrigerator with the special magnets. Antonio surveyed the destruction surrounding them. The Torino crew had been thorough in their search for evidence, overturning furniture, emptying drawers, ensuring that nothing remained to connect the Martelli family to their waterfront smuggling operations. But they'd missed this simple artwork, dismissed it as worthless decoration rather than recognizing it as evidence of the lives they'd destroyed. The house on Oakwood Street sat in a neighborhood that straddled the boundary between respectability and decay. Working-class families struggling to maintain dignity in an area where legitimate employment barely covered basic expenses. Houses like this one often served as recruitment grounds for Antonio's organization. Desperate men willing to accept risks that more fortunate people could afford to refuse. Marco examined the ransacked living room with professional interest, noting the systematic nature of the search that had preceded the family's elimination. They were looking for something specific. This wasn't random violence. Antonio nodded, recognizing the signature methods of Vincent Torino's enforcement team. The Martellis had been facilitating drug transfers through their connection to waterfront loading crews, earning modest commissions for services that should have been controlled exclusively by Salvatore operations. Standard territorial violation that required decisive response to prevent encouraging similar encroachment by other independent contractors. But standing in this destroyed home, surrounded by evidence of normal family life that had been obliterated by business decisions he'd made without considering human cost, Antonio struggled to maintain the emotional detachment that usually protected him from such connections. Children's toys scattered across the floor, family photographs torn from their frames, remnants of birthday celebrations and holiday gatherings that would never be repeated. "Benny's food bowl is gone," Lucia observed, pointing to the empty corner where pet supplies had obviously been arranged. They took his toys too, and his favorite blanket. The detail struck Antonio as particularly cruel. Evidence that the Torino crew had deliberately taken items that would torment the animal, rather than simply killing it quickly. Vincent Torino enjoyed psychological warfare, believed that causing maximum suffering sent stronger messages than efficient elimination of threats. His reputation for creative brutality had been growing throughout Chicago's underworld, challenging Antonio's position as the city's most feared crime boss. "We'll check with the neighbors," Antonio decided. Someone might have seen which direction they went. Marco's expression conveyed skepticism about conducting door-to-door inquiries in a neighborhood where residents had learned to avoid involvement in situations that attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement or criminal organizations. People here survived by maintaining careful blindness to activities that occurred outside their immediate family concerns, but an elderly woman emerged from the house next door before they could begin their canvass. Her weathered face creased with concern as she recognized Lucia. Mrs. Chen had lived on Oakwood Street for 40 years, had watched generations of children grow up in homes that struggled against economic pressures and social decay that consumed families who couldn't escape to better neighborhoods. Lucia, "Sweetheart, where have you been? I've been worried sick since Tuesday night." She glanced nervously at Antonio and Marco, recognizing the expensive suits and predatory alertness that marked them as dangerous men from worlds that intersected with her neighborhood only when violence was involved. "Mrs. Chen, did you see what happened to Benny?" Lucia asked, tears threatening to overwhelm her again. The old woman's face hardened with anger that surprised Antonio with its intensity. "Those animals threw him in the back of their truck like he was garbage." Poor thing was crying, scared out of his mind. "I called the police, but you know how much attention they pay to complaints from this neighborhood. Which direction did they go?" Antonio asked gently. Mrs. Chen studied his face, weighing the risks of providing information to men who obviously operated outside legal boundaries against her genuine affection for the child whose family had been destroyed. "North on Ashland, toward the industrial district. Big black pickup truck with Illinois plates. But I couldn't see the numbers clearly. The industrial district meant warehouses controlled by Torino operations, facilities that processed both legitimate cargo and contraband shipments through waterfront connections that had been disputed territory for months. Antonio's organization had been planning to eliminate Vincent Torino's interference with their established smuggling routes. But those plans had focused on business considerations rather than personal revenge. Now the conflict had become personal, driven by the need to rescue an innocent animal that represented something more valuable than territorial control or profit margins. Lucia's drawing crinkled in her hands as she folded it carefully, preserving the last tangible connection to a family that existed, now only in memory and crayon artwork that captured love too. Pure for the world that had destroyed it. The encrypted burner phone buzzed insistently in Antonio's jacket pocket as they drove through Chicago's industrial district. The device contained communications between rival family operations, police informants, and corrupt officials who facilitated the complex web of relationships that kept organized crime functioning despite law enforcement pressure. Marco had intercepted the phone during a recent territorial dispute, but its contents revealed connections that extended far beyond simple business rivalries. "Torino's been planning something bigger than waterfront smuggling," Antonio said, scrolling through coded messages that referenced shipment schedules, payment transfers, and personnel movements spanning multiple criminal organizations. These communications show coordination with families. From Detroit and Milwaukee, Marco guided their vehicle through streets lined with abandoned factories and struggling businesses that provided cover for illegal activities requiring industrial infrastructure. The area had been economically devastated for decades, legitimate employment replaced by underground economies that operated according to different rules than conventional commerce. "Multi-city coordination suggests they're planning to challenge your authority directly," Marco observed, using the waterfront dispute as justification for broader territorial expansion. Lucia sat quietly in the back seat and clutching her family's drawing while studying neighborhoods that became progressively more dangerous as they moved away from residential areas toward facilities controlled by criminal organizations. Her presence in their vehicle violated every security protocol. Antonio's operation followed, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon her to child services or relatives who might not understand the complex situation her survival had created. The phone revealed that Vincent Torino had been building alliances designed to undermine Salvatore, influence throughout Chicago's underworld. Recent territorial violations hadn't been random acts of aggression, but strategic probes, testing Antonio's willingness to defend established boundaries. The Martelli elimination, intended as a message discouraging further encroachment, had instead been interpreted as evidence that Antonio's organization was weakening under pressure from younger, More aggressive competitors. They're using your reputation against you, Marco said after reviewing additional messages. Spreading rumors that you're losing control, becoming soft in your old age, allowing sentimental attachments to compromise business judgment. The irony wasn't lost on Antonio. His decision to help Lucia had indeed compromised his business judgment, but not in the way his competitors imagined. Rather than weakening his resolve, her presence had awakened something more dangerous than strategic calculation or professional brutality. He was remembering what it felt like to care about outcomes beyond immediate tactical advantage. "Let them underestimate us," Antonio replied. "Arrogance makes people careless." But privately, he recognized the accuracy of his rival's assessment, showing mercy to witnesses, involving himself in civilian concerns that didn't advance organizational interests, allowing emotional considerations to influence strategic decisions. These actions represented fundamental changes in leadership style that would inevitably affect his organization's competitive position. The phone contained photographs taken during recent meetings between Torino representatives and officials from the Chicago Police Department's Organized Crime Unit. Detective Lieutenant Robert Kowalski, who'd been providing intelligence about pending investigations in exchange for monthly payments, was now apparently receiving significantly larger sums for information about Salvatore operations specifically. "Kowalski's been feeding them details about our security procedures," Marco said, his voice tight with anger at the betrayal. "Patrol schedules, surveillance equipment locations, personnel assignments. They've been planning this operation for months. The corruption extended beyond individual officers to include county prosecutors, federal agents, and judicial officials whose cooperation ensured that criminal organizations could operate with minimal interference from law enforcement. But these relationships were always precarious, dependent on maintaining careful balance between providing valuable services and avoiding attention that could compromise their official positions. They know about tonight's meeting with the East Side crews," Marco continued, reading messages that detailed surveillance reports about Salvatore activities. "Location, timing, personnel involved. They're planning an ambush." Antonio processed this intelligence while watching Lucia study the industrial landscape passing outside their windows. Her innocent presence in their world of calculated violence felt like a judgment on choices he'd made throughout his career. Decisions that prioritized organizational success over human consequences that extended far beyond immediate participants. The phone's final messages revealed the most troubling intelligence. Vincent Torino had been negotiating with Anthony Castellano, head of Chicago's second-largest crime family, about dividing Salvatore territory between their organizations. The plan involved systematic elimination of Antonio's key lieutenants, seizure of waterfront facilities, and absorption of profitable operations by competitors who'd been waiting years for opportunities to expand their influence. "They're not just challenging us," Marco said grimly. "They're planning to eliminate us." Entirely, Antonio understood that his decision to show mercy to one child had inadvertently triggered events that threatened every person who depended on his organization for protection and livelihood. His momentary compassion could destroy lives of loyal associates who'd served him faithfully for years, men who'd trusted his judgment even when they didn't understand his motivations. But looking at Lucia's reflection in the window, seeing her carefully fold the drawing of her murdered family, Antonio realized that some choices transcended strategic calculation. Sometimes doing right mattered more than doing well, even when righteousness carried prices that seemed impossible to pay. The newspaper clipping was yellowed with age, but the headline remained stark and unforgiving. "Family of 4 found dead in industrial district. Police suspect gang violence." Vincent Torino kept the article in his wallet like a trophy, pulling it out during meetings to remind associates of his reputation for thoroughness. when eliminating problems that threatened his business interests. "You killed them to send me a message," Antonio said, his voice carrying the controlled fury that preceded violence. They stood in Torino's office above a legitimate trucking company that provided cover for waterfront smuggling operations, surrounded by men whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned through years of shared struggle. Vincent smiled, settling behind his desk with the casual confidence of someone who believed superior numbers guaranteed favorable outcomes in confrontational situations. At 42, he'd built his organization through aggressive expansion and strategic brutality that challenged established territorial boundaries throughout Chicago's underworld. His reputation for creative cruelty had attracted soldiers who enjoyed their work, professionals who found satisfaction in causing maximum suffering while achieving business objectives. The Martellis were facilitating operations that violated our territorial agreements, Vincent replied. Standard business practice required decisive response to prevent encouraging similar violations by other independent contractors. The casual dismissal of human life as business expense triggered memories that Antonio had spent years suppressing. Isabella's funeral, when he'd stood beside a casket that contained dreams he'd never see fulfilled because business had always taken precedence over family obligations. Maria Salvatore's death, when cancer consumed her while he was too busy with organizational concerns to spend her final weeks providing comfort and companionship. "You missed something," Antonio said quietly. "Did I?" Vincent's expression suggested professional interest rather than concern about operational oversights. "A child survived. She's been looking for her dog." The smile faded from Vincent's face as he processed implications that extended beyond simple witness elimination. Children who survive family executions represented complications that could attract law enforcement attention, media coverage, and political pressure that disrupted the careful balance between criminal operations and official tolerance that kept underground economies functioning. "Where is this child now?" Vincent asked, his tone shifting to match the seriousness Antonio's revelation deserved. "Safe, protected, under my personal guarantee." The declaration hung in the air between them, formal notification that Antonio Salvatore was accepting responsibility for protecting someone who could potentially damage both their organizations. In their world, such guarantees carried weight that transcended legal contracts or business agreements, binding obligations that could only be dissolved through death or mutual consent. Vincent's lieutenants shifted nervously, recognizing the implications of Antonio's statement, while waiting for their boss to respond appropriately to what amounted to a direct challenge to his authority. The golden retriever that had been taken from the Martelli home sat in a cage in the corner of the office, physical evidence of the cruelty that had motivated this confrontation. "The dog was never part of our business arrangement," Vincent said carefully. "Personal property seized during standard elimination procedures. Return the animal. I'm afraid that's not possible. The dog has already served its purpose as leverage in negotiations with other families who needed to understand the consequences of territorial violations." Antonio's hands remained steady despite the rage building in his chest. Decades of professional discipline containing emotions that could compromise tactical judgment in dangerous situations. But looking at the caged animal that represented everything innocent and helpless about the world he'd helped create, he felt something shift inside his moral framework that had been rigid for 30 years. "Last chance. Vincent, you're not in a position to make demands, old man. Your organization's influence has been declining for months, while younger, more aggressive competitors expand their operations. This situation with the child proves that sentimentality is compromising your business judgment." The newspaper clipping remained on Vincent's desk, evidence of the systematic destruction of a family whose only crime had been accepting work that paid better than legitimate employment available in neighborhoods. where honest jobs couldn't support basic living expenses. 4 people had died to send a message about territorial boundaries, but their deaths had created complications that neither criminal organization had anticipated. "The child wants her dog back," Antonio said. "That's a reasonable request. The child is a witness to elimination procedures. She represents operational security risks that require permanent resolution through methods that don't leave loose ends, threatening organizational safety." Vincent's casual discussion of murdering a 6-year-old girl crystallized something in Antonio's consciousness that had been building since Lucia first wandered into his warehouse. The distance between strategic necessity and moral horror had collapsed, leaving him face to face with the true cost of choices he'd been making for decades without acknowledging their human impact. "You're right about one thing," Antonio said. "This is about more than territorial boundaries now." He turned toward the door, his departure carrying implications that Vincent's soldiers recognized, even if their boss chose to ignore the warning signs that preceded violent resolution of disputes that couldn't be settled through negotiation. Antonio's hands shook as he pulled the crumpled letter from his desk drawer, ink smeared from tears he'd shed 23 years ago, but never sent. "My dearest Isabella," it began, "I know I wasn't the father you deserved, but I hope you understand that everything I did was to protect our family, to build something that would keep you safe in a dangerous world." The confession had been written the night after her funeral, when guilt finally overwhelmed the emotional barriers that usually protected him from acknowledging the cost of his choices. Isabella had died driving to her graduation ceremony alone because business obligations had prevented him from accompanying her. Another meeting that seemed urgent at the time, but felt meaningless compared to the daughter he'd never see again. "Boss, we have a problem." Marco entered the office without knocking, his expression carrying the weight of information that would complicate an already deteriorating situation. Tommy Ricci talked. Before we could complete the interrogation, he gave Vincent everything he knew about our waterfront operations. Antonio folded the letter carefully, returning it to the drawer beside Isabella's pink elephant and other reminders of the family he'd lost to priorities that seemed less important with each passing year. The confession would never be sent now, just as it hadn't been sent for 2 decades. But writing it had served as reminder of promises he'd failed to keep and relationships he'd sacrificed for organizational success. What did Ricci know? Antonio asked, though he suspected the answer would reveal security breaches that extended far beyond single informant's knowledge. Shipping schedules, personnel assignments, payment procedures for our police contacts. Enough to disrupt operations for months while we rebuild compromised networks. Marco's frustration was evident, despite his professional composure. More importantly, he knew about tonight's meeting with our remaining allies. The meeting had been scheduled to consolidate support among crime families who remained loyal to Antonio's organization despite increasing pressure from Vincent. Torino's expanding coalition. Chicago's underworld was choosing sides in a conflict that would determine territorial control for years, and neutrality was becoming impossible as violence escalated beyond sustainable levels. "Cancel the meeting," Antonio decided. "We can't risk walking into an ambush." "Sir, canceling will be interpreted as weakness. The families we're trying to keep loyal will see it as evidence that we can't protect our own operations, let alone provide security for allied organizations." But Antonio was thinking about Lucia, asleep in the safe house apartment where Marco had arranged temporary protection. The child had collapsed from exhaustion after days of trauma, her small body finally succumbing to stress that would have broken most adults. She'd clutched her family's drawing while sleeping, tears still wet on her cheeks even in unconsciousness. "My men are questioning my judgment," Marco continued quietly. "They understand loyalty, but they don't understand compassion that compromises operational security. Protecting a witness violates every principle we've operated under for decades." The admission confirmed what Antonio had been sensing for days. His decision to help Lucia was fracturing the organization he'd spent 30 years building. Soldiers who'd followed him through territorial wars and law enforcement investigations now questioned whether sentiment was compromising his ability to make strategic decisions that protected their interests. What are they saying? That you're getting old. That grief over your wife's death is affecting your judgment. That showing mercy to a child proves you're losing. The edge that made this organization successful, Marco's voice carried the weight of uncomfortable truths that loyal subordinates sometimes had to share with leaders they respected. Antonio understood the logic behind their concerns, while recognizing that explaining his motivations would only confirm their fears about his declining effectiveness. How could he tell professional criminals that rescuing a dog mattered more than maintaining territorial control? How could he explain that protecting one innocent child was worth risking an empire he'd built through decades of calculated violence? The letter in his drawer contained confessions he'd never shared with anyone, acknowledgments of moral compromises that had seemed necessary at the time but felt increasingly hollow as years accumulated. Isabella would have understood his decision to help Lucia. She'd believed that protecting the innocent was humanity's highest calling, that strength without compassion was just another form of weakness disguised as power. "Schedule a meeting with Anthony Castellano," Antonio said finally. "Private discussion, neutral location. It's time to test whether this alliance against us is as solid as Vincent believes." Marco nodded, recognizing the strategic wisdom of attempting to fracture opposing coalitions through direct negotiation rather than violent confrontation. But his expression suggested continued concern about Antonio's emotional state and its potential impact on decisions that would determine their organization's survival. Outside, Chicago's night concealed activities that would reshape the city's criminal landscape based on choices made by men who understood power but struggled with consequences that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. Lucia slept peacefully, unaware that her survival had triggered events that threatened everyone who'd chosen to protect her innocence against a world designed to destroy it. The surveillance photographs scattered across Antonio's war room table showed Benny confined in a cage behind Vincent Torino's trucking facility. The golden retriever's once lustrous coat now matted and dull from days of neglect. The images had been taken by Joey Marconi, a freelance photographer who sold intelligence to whatever organization paid best. His telephoto lens capturing details that confirmed both the dog's location and the security measures protecting the compound. 12 men on rotating shifts, Marco reported, pointing to figures visible in the background of successive photos. Motion sensors along the perimeter, armed patrols every 20 minutes, surveillance cameras covering all approaches. Vincent's treating this like a military installation. Antonio studied the photographs with tactical awareness, honed through decades of planning operations that required precision timing and flawless execution. The compound represented Vincent's primary base of operations, the administrative center from which he coordinated smuggling activities, money laundering, and territorial expansion that threatened established criminal organizations throughout Chicago. "He's using the dog as bait," Antonio observed. "Wants us to attempt a rescue so he can justify eliminating us for violating his property." The tactical situation favored defenders who knew the terrain and had prepared killing fields designed to channel attackers into predetermined zones where superior firepower could overwhelm even well-trained assault teams. Vincent had been expecting retaliation since their confrontational meeting, positioning resources to maximize his advantages while minimizing Antonio's operational options, but Lucia insisted on participating, despite the obvious dangers her presence would create during combat operations. She sat in the corner of the room, carefully drawing maps from memory of the trucking facility's interior layout, her child's perspective providing details that adult surveillance might have missed. Her small hands moved with determined precision as she sketched corridors, storage areas, and security checkpoints based on visits she'd made with her father during legitimate business transactions. "Benny knows my voice," she explained when Antonio questioned the wisdom of including her in rescue planning. "He'll come to me even if he's scared or hurt. Without me, he might hide or run away when you try to save him." The logic was sound, despite the unacceptable risks her participation would create. Professional soldiers could neutralize armed resistance and secure tactical objectives, but they couldn't communicate with terrified animals using voices that represented safety and comfort. Lucia's presence might mean the difference between successful rescue and operation failure that would leave Benny dead while exposing Antonio's team to unnecessary casualties. "There's another consideration," Marco said quietly. "Intelligence suggests Vincent's planning to execute the dog tomorrow night as part of a message to families who might be considering alliance with us. Public demonstration of what happens to anyone who challenges his authority." The timeline compressed their operational window while increasing pressure to attempt rescue, despite tactical disadvantages that made success improbable. Waiting for better circumstances might mean waiting until Benny was already dead, killed to prove points about territorial control that had nothing to do with the innocent animal caught. Between competing criminal organizations, Antonio examined the compound's defensive positions while calculating casualty estimates for various assault scenarios. Direct frontal attack would result in significant losses among his personnel, men who'd served loyally for years and deserved better than dying for symbolic gestures that wouldn't advance organizational interests. Stealth infiltration offered better survival odds, but lower probability of successful extraction given the facility's sophisticated security systems. "We'll go tonight," he decided. "Three-man team, minimal equipment, in and out before they can coordinate effective response." "Boss, that's suicide," Marco protested. 3 men against 12, no supporting fire, escape routes that lead through territory they control. Even if we reach the dog, we'll never make it out alive. But Antonio was studying Lucia's hand-drawn maps, noting details that professional reconnaissance had missed. Loading dock schedules, shift change procedures, blind spots in surveillance coverage that existed because security planners had focused on preventing human infiltration rather than considering how children might navigate familiar territory, using routes adults wouldn't recognize. "She knows things we don't," Antonio said, indicating Lucia's careful notations about hidden entrances, emergency exits, and patrol patterns she'd observed during family visits to the facility. Her father did business there for months. She's been inside those buildings, knows the layout better than Vincent's own security team. The photographs showed Benny lying motionless in his cage, either sleeping or too weak from mistreatment to maintain normal activity levels. Time was running out for the animal that represented innocence destroyed by conflicts he couldn't understand. Caught between organizations that measured success through profit margins rather than moral considerations that included protecting helpless creatures from unnecessary suffering, Lucia looked up from her map-making, eyes bright with hope that adults she trusted would keep promises they'd made to restore what violence had taken from her world. "When do we go get Benny?" The photograph lay on Antonio's desk like an accusation, Marco embracing Anthony Castellano outside a restaurant on the north side, both men smiling with the casual warmth of old friends rather than rival criminal organization leaders. The image had been taken 3 days ago by surveillance equipment Antonio didn't know existed, delivered anonymously to his office with a note that simply read, "Judas Kiss." "How long?" Antonio asked, without looking up from the damning evidence. Marco shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his expression carrying the weight of betrayal that ran deeper than simple business disagreements. For 15 years, he'd been Antonio's most trusted lieutenant, the man who knew every operational detail, every security weakness. every personal vulnerability that could be exploited by enemies seeking to destroy what they'd built together. "Since your wife died," Marco admitted, "the other families approached me during the funeral, suggested that grief was affecting your judgment, that maybe it was time for younger leadership to guide our organization through changing circumstances. The timing made sense with sickening clarity. Martha's death had indeed affected Antonio's judgment, made him question choices that had once seemed strategically necessary, wonder whether 30 years of accumulated violence had been worth the isolation that surrounded him during his final years. Her loss had created emotional vulnerability that competitors had recognized and exploited through the person closest to Antonio's decision-making process. "They offered you control of the waterfront operations," Antonio said, understanding the negotiation that had produced this betrayal, among other considerations. "Anthony's organization has been growing rapidly, while ours has remained static, focused on maintaining existing territory rather than expanding into new opportunities. The younger generation sees possibilities that maybe we've been too conservative to pursue." The photograph captured more than simple treachery. It revealed strategic planning that extended months into the past, coordination between rival families that had been building while Antonio focused on legitimate concerns about organizational security and competitive positioning. His trusted lieutenant had been reporting every conversation, every operational detail, every weakness that could be exploited during inevitable confrontation. "What about Lucia?" Antonio asked. "Was protecting her part of your arrangement with Castellano?" Marco's hesitation revealed the moral complexity that had complicated his betrayal, evidence that some aspects of Antonio's recent behavior had challenged assumptions about necessary ruthlessness that typically governed criminal organization leadership. The child's presence in their world had forced decisions that transcended simple business calculations, created situations where loyalty conflicted with practical considerations about organizational survival. "The girl wasn't part of our original discussion," Marco said carefully. "Your decision to protect her surprised everyone, including me. It demonstrated weakness that made our position more vulnerable to challenge from competitors who don't share your sentimental attachments." But Antonio heard something else in Marco's voice, uncertainty about choices that had seemed logical when motivated by ambitious calculations, but felt less defensible when confronted with actual consequences for people who depended on his protection. Betraying a boss was standard business practice when leadership became ineffective, but destroying a child's last hope for justice required different moral compromises. "She trusts you," Antonio observed. "Believes you're helping rescue her dog because it's the right thing to do." "I am helping," Marco insisted. "Tonight's operation proceeds as planned. Whatever arrangement I have with other families doesn't change my commitment to completing this mission successfully." The contradiction revealed the psychological strain that was affecting Marco's ability to reconcile competing loyalties that pulled him in opposite directions. Professional ambition demanded that he facilitate Antonio's elimination to advance his own career prospects, but personal honor required protecting innocence that had somehow survived in their world of calculated brutality. "The other families expect me to eliminate you during tonight's operation," Marco continued. "Arrange circumstances that make your death appear to result from tactical miscalculation rather than internal betrayal." Antonio nodded, recognizing the elegant solution that would remove him from competition, while preserving Marco's reputation for loyalty among soldiers who would serve under new leadership. Dying during heroic attempt to rescue a child's pet would enhance rather than diminish the legend that surrounded Antonio's reputation, creating martyrdom that competitors could exploit for their own purposes. "But you won't," Antonio said with certainty that surprised them both. "No," Marco admitted, "I won't. Whatever mistakes you've made recently, you don't deserve to die protecting something innocent and helpless. That's not weakness, that's the kind of strength we used to believe this organization represented before ambition replaced honor as our primary motivation. The confession hung between them like bridge across chasm that had been widening for months. Acknowledgement that some betrayals carried prices that extended beyond immediate tactical advantages. Outside, Chicago's night concealed preparations for violence that would reshape criminal territories according to plans that neither loyalty nor ambition could control once bullets started. Flying, Lucia waited in the safe house, trusting men who couldn't trust each other to keep promises that had become more important than territorial disputes or organizational survival. Lucia's hand-drawn map covered the dashboard of their surveillance vehicle, her child's perspective revealing details that professional reconnaissance had missed entirely. Crayon marks indicated where Papa took smoke breaks, bathroom with broken lock, and back door that squeaks really loud. Intelligence that could mean the difference between successful infiltration and walking into a carefully prepared ambush. The guards always eat pizza at 10 o'clock, she whispered, pointing to a loading dock area she'd marked with careful precision. Mr. Torino orders from Tony's every night, same time, same driver. They open the big door to let him in because he carries lots of boxes. Antonio studied the child's intelligence with growing appreciation for observational skills that adults typically dismissed as irrelevant childhood curiosity. During months of legitimate business visits with her father, Lucia had unconsciously catalogued security patterns, staff behaviors, and operational routines that created predictable vulnerabilities in what appeared to be an impenetrable defensive position. "How many guards in the building where they're keeping Benny?" Marco asked, though his question carried undertones that suggested continuing internal conflict about participating in operation that contradicted his arrangements with rival families. "Usually 2, but sometimes 3 if Mr. Vincent is meeting with important people. They play cards and drink beer when they think nobody's watching." Lucia's description matched. Surveillance reports about relaxed security protocols during evening hours when legitimate business activities provided cover for criminal operations. The timing would be crucial. Pizza delivery created 15-minute window when attention focused on food distribution rather than perimeter security. Guard rotation occurred every 2 hours, leaving brief gaps when positions remained temporarily unmanned. Lucia's knowledge of internal layout could guide them through corridors that surveillance cameras didn't monitor effectively. "There's something else," Antonio said, pointing to military-style equipment visible in recent photographs. Vincent's brought in professional soldiers, not just street criminals. These men have combat training, tactical discipline, equipment that suggests preparation for serious warfare rather than simple territorial dispute. Marco recognized the implications immediately. Vincent Torino's organization had evolved beyond typical criminal enterprise into something resembling paramilitary operation designed for sustained conflict against established crime families. The escalation represented fundamental shift in Chicago's underworld that would require corresponding adaptation by organizations that hope to survive increasing violence. "They're planning something bigger than eliminating us," Marco observed. "This level of preparation suggests coordination with federal agencies, maybe law enforcement task forces that want to use our conflict as justification for broader crackdown on organized crime activities." But Antonio's attention remained focused on Lucia's map, particularly her careful notation about secret tunnel where workers hide cigarettes. The child's father had been involved in waterfront smuggling operations that required discreet movement of contraband through facilities designed to appear legitimate to casual inspection. Emergency exits and hidden passages were standard features of buildings that served dual purposes. "Can you show us this tunnel?" Antonio asked gently. Lucia nodded eagerly, her trust in adult competence remaining intact despite everything she'd witnessed over the past week. It goes from the big warehouse to the office. Building where they keep Benny. Papa said it was built during prohibition for moving special cargo that couldn't go through regular doors. The tunnel represented tactical advantage that could neutralize Vincent's superior numbers and defensive preparations. Underground approach would bypass perimeter security, surveillance systems, and guard positions that protected conventional access routes. More importantly, it offered extraction path that didn't require fighting through coordinated resistance during withdrawal phase of the operation. We go in at 10:15, Antonio decided. During pizza delivery when their attention is focused elsewhere. 3-man team, minimal equipment, get in and get out before they realize we've breached their security. Marco checked his weapon with professional efficiency despite emotional reservations about operation that contradicted agreements he'd made with competing criminal organizations. His betrayal of Antonio remained tactically necessary for advancing personal ambitions, but protecting Lucia had become moral imperative that transcended political calculations about organizational survival. "Boss, I need you to understand something," Marco said quietly. "After tonight, things change between us. I've made commitments that can't be undone, arrangements that affect everyone in our organization. This mission might be the last time we work together." Antonio nodded, recognizing that their partnership would end regardless of tonight's outcome. Either he would die during the rescue attempt, eliminating threat to Marco's advancement prospects, or he would survive to face inevitable confrontation with rival families who expected his elimination as condition for supporting new leadership structure. "Just help me save the dog," Antonio replied. "Whatever happens afterward, at least we'll have done something right." Lucia studied her map one final time, memorizing details that would guide 3 dangerous men through hostile territory, toward goal that mattered more than territorial control or criminal organization politics. Somewhere in Vincent Torino's compound, Benny waited for rescue that represented hope's last stand against forces designed to destroy innocence wherever it survived. Benny's collar lay twisted and bloodied in the empty cage, the metal nameplate dented from violent impact that had torn it from the dog's neck during his final moments. Antonio stared at the physical evidence of cruelty that served no strategic purpose beyond psychological warfare designed to inflict maximum emotional damage on anyone who discovered the remains. "They killed him this morning," Vincent Torino said from the doorway, flanked by armed soldiers who'd been waiting in the shadows while Antonio's team fought through outer defenses. Professional execution, quick and clean. No suffering beyond what was necessary to make the appropriate point about challenging my authority. The cage still smelled of fear and death. Industrial disinfectant, failing to mask odors that spoke of deliberate torture, extending beyond simple elimination. Vincent's reputation for creative brutality had been earned through systematic infliction of suffering that transcended strategic necessity. Sadism disguised as business practice by men who enjoyed causing pain for its own sake. Lucia's heartbroken scream echoed through the warehouse as she saw the empty cage. The bloodied collar, the confirmation that her last connection to family happiness had been destroyed by the same forces that had consumed everyone else she loved. Her small body shook with grief that encompassed more than losing a pet. She was mourning the final death of childhood innocence that had somehow survived until this moment. "You didn't have to kill the dog," Antonio said, his voice carrying controlled fury that preceded violence. "The animal wasn't a threat to your operations. Everything you care about is a threat to my operations," Vincent replied. "Sentiment makes you weak. Compassion compromises your judgment. Mercy creates vulnerabilities that competitors can exploit to destroy what you've built." The philosophical justification for cruelty revealed mindset that had guided Vincent's rise through Chicago's criminal hierarchy. Success achieved through systematic elimination of human connections that might interfere with strategic calculation. He'd learned to view emotional attachment as operational liability rather than source of strength that motivated extraordinary effort. But Antonio's rage wasn't strategic calculation. It was paternal instinct that had been dormant for decades, suddenly awakened by witnessing deliberate destruction of innocence. Looking at Lucia's grief, seeing trust she'd placed in adult competence shattered by reality too brutal for children to comprehend, he felt something fundamental shift in his moral framework. "Marco, get her out of here," Antonio ordered, though his lieutenant remained frozen by competing loyalties that made decisive action impossible. Vincent's soldiers maintained professional alertness despite their tactical advantage, recognizing that cornered predators often fought with desperation that made them more dangerous than circumstances suggested. Antonio Salvatore's reputation for violence hadn't been diminished by recent displays of mercy. It had been focused toward purposes that transcended simple territorial control. "Your organization dies tonight," Vincent continued conversationally, along with everyone stupid enough to follow leadership that prioritizes sentimental attachments over practical business considerations. "Chicago's criminal landscape requires modernization that your outdated methods can't provide." The monologue served dual purposes: psychological warfare designed to demoralize opponents, while buying time for additional reinforcements to arrive and eliminate witnesses to operations that couldn't tolerate public scrutiny. Vincent had been planning this confrontation for months, preparing killing ground where superior numbers could overwhelm even well-trained opponents through coordinated raw power. But Lucia's presence changed tactical equations that Vincent had calculated. Based on conventional criminal behavior, looking at the grieving child, Antonio realized that some battles transcended strategic considerations about organizational survival or competitive advantage. Sometimes protecting innocence mattered more than preserving life, especially when life had been compromised by choices that destroyed everything worth protecting. "You made one mistake," Antonio said quietly. "What's that?" "You taught me that mercy is weakness. Now I remember why I stopped showing it 30 years ago. The transformation was visible in Antonio's posture, facial expression, breathing pattern that shifted from controlled anger to predatory focus that had made him Chicago's most feared crime boss. Decades of accumulated violence rose to surface like oil slick that couldn't be contained once pressure exceeded containment capacity. Vincent's confidence wavered as he recognized change in opponent who'd seemed defeated moments earlier. Professional soldiers understood difference between desperate resistance and calculated aggression, between random violence and strategic brutality applied with surgical precision to achieve specific objectives. Lucia stopped crying, sensing shift in emotional atmosphere that preceded events too dangerous for civilian presence. Marco finally moved, reaching for the child while understanding that extraction might be impossible once violence began in earnest. The warehouse became tomb where innocence would either be preserved or destroyed based on decisions made by men who'd forgotten how to value anything beyond power and profit. Antonio's hand moved toward concealed weapon with speed that surprised Vincent's soldiers despite their combat training. Some transformations couldn't be prevented once moral restraints dissolved under pressure that exceeded structural capacity for mercy and world. Designed to reward cruelty above compassion, the legal adoption papers lay spread across Antonio's kitchen table, official documents that would transfer custody of Lucia Martelli to Elena Rossetti, a social worker who specialized in placing children orphaned by criminal violence. The paperwork represented Antonio's final attempt to provide legitimate protection for innocence that had somehow survived in world designed to destroy everything pure and helpless. "She needs a normal life," Antonio explained to Marco as they reviewed arrangements that would relocate Lucia to Wisconsin. far from Chicago's criminal enterprises and territorial disputes that continued claiming innocent victims. Family who can give her childhood, education, future that doesn't involve looking over her shoulder for enemies she didn't make. Marco studied the documents with professional attention to detail that had made him invaluable during 15 years of managing complex criminal operations. But his focus seemed distracted by competing considerations that extended beyond simple logistics of protecting witness to organizational activities that could compromise multiple criminal enterprises. The other families won't forget she exists, Marco warned. Vincent's death sent messages about what happens when you threaten your interests, but it also demonstrated that you're willing to eliminate established leaders to protect civilian concerns. That makes you unpredictable, dangerous in ways that transcend normal business competition. The assassination of Vincent Torino had indeed sent shockwaves through Chicago's underworld, proof that Antonio Salvatore retained capacity for extreme violence despite recent displays of mercy that competitors had interpreted as weakness. The execution had been personal rather than strategic, motivated by grief over destroyed innocence rather than calculated response to territorial violations. But eliminating Vincent had also triggered retaliation from criminal organizations that viewed his death as declaration of war against established order that maintained profitable equilibrium between competing enterprises. Chicago's crime. Families were choosing sides in conflict that would reshape territorial boundaries through violence that couldn't be contained within traditional limits of professional disputes. How long before they move against us? Antonio asked. Hours, not days. Anthony Castellano's mobilizing resources from Detroit and Milwaukee, coordination that suggests planning that extends beyond simple retaliation for Vincent's elimination. They're treating this as opportunity to eliminate your organization entirely. The timeline confirmed what Antonio had suspected. Since deciding to help Lucia, showing mercy to witnesses, had indeed compromised his strategic position beyond recovery through conventional negotiation or tactical adjustment. His competitors had correctly identified sentimental attachment as operational vulnerability that could be exploited to destroy what he'd built through 30 years of careful expansion. Elena Rossetti arrived, precisely on schedule, her professional demeanor masking personal reservations about facilitating adoption arrangements requested by criminal organization leaders. Social workers typically avoided involvement with Mafia families, but Lucia's circumstances required exceptional measures that transcended normal procedural limitations. The family in Wisconsin has been thoroughly vetted, Elena assured Antonio. Teachers, stable marriage, no connections to criminal activities. They've raised 2 adopted children successfully, understood. And the special challenges that trauma survivors face during adjustment periods. Lucia sat quietly in the corner, clutching her family's blood-stained drawing while listening to adults discuss her future in terms that reduced her to procedural consideration rather than human being whose world had been systematically destroyed by forces beyond her comprehension. Her grief over Benny's death had evolved into protective numbness that worried Antonio more than tears. What about her emotional recovery? Antonio asked. Professional counseling, specialized therapy for children who've witnessed violence. The trauma won't disappear overnight, but with proper support, she can develop coping mechanisms that allow normal childhood development. Elena's expertise provided reassurance about possibilities for healing that extended beyond immediate physical protection. But Antonio recognized that some wounds never healed completely, that Lucia would carry scars from these experiences regardless of whatever professional intervention she received. Her innocence had been destroyed not by single traumatic event, but by systematic exposure to adult cruelty that she couldn't process or understand. I want her to know that someone cared enough to fight for her, Antonio said, that not all adults use violence to solve problems, that protecting innocent people is worth whatever it costs. The adoption papers required his signature as temporary, guardian legal fiction that granted authority he'd assumed through force rather than official process. But signing meant acknowledging that his protection had expiration date, that Lucia's safety required distance from world that had already taken everything else she loved. "Will I see you again?" Lucia asked, as Elena prepared documents for final processing. Antonio knelt beside her chair, meeting eyes that held trust despite everything she'd witnessed, faith in adult competence that somehow survived exposure to systematic brutality that had destroyed her family. Her question carried weight that extended beyond simple curiosity about future contact. She was asking whether promises meant anything in a world where violence typically determined outcomes. "You'll be safe," he promised. "That's what matters most." The evasion protected her from truth about his probable survival prospects while preserving hope that adult protection might actually be reliable despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Outside, Chicago's criminal organizations prepared for war that would determine whether compassion could coexist with power in a world that typically rewarded cruelty above mercy. The flames consumed Antonio's family photograph with methodical cruelty, Isabella's smiling face disappearing into ash, while Martha's wedding dress dissolved into smoke that carried 30 years of accumulated memories toward Chicago's dark sky. The safe house had been compromised through intelligence leaks that revealed locations Antonio had believed secure from detection by rival criminal organizations. "They found us through police surveillance networks," Marco reported, stuffing essential documents into duffel bags while monitoring radio frequencies that carried tactical communications between attacking forces. Kowalski fed them real-time information about our movements, safe house locations, personnel assignments that made this ambush possible. Antonio watched decades of careful planning reduced to emergency evacuation procedures that might not succeed, against coordinated assault by multiple crime families working in unprecedented cooperation. The alliance against his organization had crystallized into operational reality that demonstrated how effectively his competitors had exploited perceived weakness created by his decision to protect civilian witness. Lucia pressed against the basement wall, eyes wide with terror that recalled her family's final moments while armed men positioned themselves for assault that would leave no survivors to complicate future territorial arrangements. Her presence in the safe house violated every security protocol Antonio's organization followed, but abandoning her to child services would have guaranteed death sentence from families who viewed witnesses as unacceptable operational risks. "How many?" Antonio asked, checking ammunition supplies that seemed inadequate for sustained defense against superior numbers equipped with military-grade weapons. 30, maybe more. Castellano brought soldiers from Detroit. The Torino crew brought reinforcements from Milwaukee. This isn't random retaliation. It's systematic elimination designed to destroy our organization completely. The attackers had positioned themselves with tactical precision that suggested professional military training rather than typical street criminal improvisation. Sniper positions covered all exit routes. Assault teams coordinated movements through encrypted communications. Support vehicles blocked retreat paths that would normally provide escape options during emergency situations. But Antonio's attention focused on corrupted police intelligence that had made this ambush possible. Detective Lieutenant Kowalski had been providing information about law enforcement activities for years, selling surveillance reports and investigation details that helped criminal organizations avoid prosecution for activities that generated substantial profit margins. "The corruption extends beyond individual officers," Marco observed, monitoring police radio traffic that revealed official response to violence erupting across Chicago's South Side. Response times are being deliberately delayed, patrol assignments redirected away from this area. They want us eliminated as much as our criminal competitors do. The realization carried implications that extended beyond immediate tactical concerns about surviving coordinated assault. Law enforcement agencies had apparently decided that eliminating Antonio's organization served their interests better than maintaining traditional balance between criminal enterprises that kept violence within manageable parameters. Lucia clutched her family's drawing, now creased and torn from days of handling by small fingers that sought comfort from images of people who couldn't protect her anymore. The artwork had survived explosion that destroyed her home, shootout that killed Vincent Torino, and now faced incineration during assault designed to eliminate everyone connected to her survival. "There's something you need to know," Marco said quietly, his voice carrying weight of confession that had been building since their partnership began dissolving under pressure from competing loyalties. "I've been feeding information to Castellano for months, but I never told them about tonight's location. Someone else revealed our position. The admission confirmed what Antonio had suspected. Betrayal extended beyond Marco's documented collaboration with rival families to include additional security breaches that compromised operational integrity at fundamental levels. Multiple sources were providing intelligence that made effective defense impossible against enemies who knew their capabilities, limitations, and tactical preferences. Who else has access to safe house locations? Only 3 people knew about this facility. You, me, and Tommy Ricci. Marco's expression revealed growing understanding of implications that extended beyond simple tactical miscalculation. But Tommy's been dead for 2 days. The timeline didn't match Marco's explanation, suggesting that intelligence had been compromised through channels that neither man had identified or controlled. Someone within Antonio's inner circle had been providing detailed operational information while maintaining appearance of loyalty that concealed systematic betrayal extending over significant time periods. Outside, assault teams began final positioning for coordinated attack that would overwhelm defensive capabilities through superior firepower and tactical coordination. The safe house had become killing ground, where Antonio's criminal career would end in violence that mirrored how it began, surrounded by enemies, protecting innocent life that most people in his position would sacrifice to preserve personal survival. The burning photograph released final wisps of smoke that carried visual evidence of legitimate happiness he'd once believed possible, despite choices that made such joy increasingly unlikely as years accumulated. Now his past was literally turning to ash, while his future narrowed to decisions that would determine whether Lucia survived long enough to reach the family that could provide safety his protection had failed to guarantee. Antonio's father's wedding ring caught the dim light filtering through stained glass windows as he slipped it onto his finger for the first time in 30 years. The simple gold band had been stored in his wallet since the day he'd chosen criminal. Life over legitimate marriage, when violence became more familiar than love, when protecting family meant destroying other families to maintain competitive advantage. "This is where it started," Antonio said, looking around the abandoned sanctuary of St. Anthony's Cathedral where he'd served as altar boy before understanding that faith couldn't coexist with survival in a world that rewarded brutality over compassion. "Where I made my first communion, where I promised to protect innocent people instead of exploiting them for profit." The church had been condemned for 5 years, but structural damage hadn't eliminated sacred atmosphere that still lingered despite broken windows and graffiti that covered walls, once decorated with images of saints who'd martyred themselves protecting beliefs that secular authorities couldn't tolerate. Pigeons nested in rafters, where choir voices had once lifted prayers toward heaven that seemed increasingly distant as urban decay consumed traditional institutions. Lucia sat in the front pew, Her family's drawings spread across her lap while she studied faces that smiled from artwork, created during happier times when parents could protect children from forces that operated beyond legal or moral constraints. Her presence in this sacred space felt like judgment on choices Antonio had made throughout career that prioritized organizational success over human consequences. "My mama brought me to church every Sunday," Lucia said quietly. "She said God watches over people who can't protect themselves, that angels help children when their parents can't be there anymore." The innocent faith pierced Antonio's emotional armor more effectively than bullets or threats from criminal competitors who understood violence but couldn't comprehend trust that survived exposure to systematic brutality. Looking at this child who still believed in divine protection despite witnessing her family's destruction, he felt something shift inside moral framework that had been rigid for decades. Marco appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by emergency vehicles that surrounded the cathedral where Chicago's criminal underworld had converged for final confrontation. Blood stained his shirt from wounds sustained during fighting that had consumed entire South Side. Territorial warfare that would reshape criminal landscape regardless of tonight's outcome. They're positioned on all sides, Marco reported. Castellano's people control the main entrances. Torino's remaining crew has the rear approaches covered. Police have established perimeter that prevents civilian interference. No escape routes remain open, but Antonio wasn't planning escape anymore. The wedding ring reminded him of legitimate love he'd abandoned when criminal ambitions seemed more important than family obligations. Choices that had cost him relationships with people who mattered more than territorial control or profit margins that funded lifestyle built on other people's suffering. "How many loyalists do we have left?" Antonio asked. 12 men, maybe 15 if Joey's crew makes it through police checkpoint on Michigan Avenue. Against 60, maybe 70 opponents who've been coordinating this assault for weeks. Marco's tactical assessment confirmed what Antonio already understood. Survival through conventional resistance was mathematically impossible. The odds didn't concern Antonio as much as ensuring Lucia's safety through whatever violent resolution awaited them. His decision to protect her had triggered events that threatened everyone who'd served his organization loyally. Men who deserved better than dying for symbolic gestures that wouldn't advance strategic objectives beyond, demonstrating that mercy still existed. In a world designed to reward cruelty, there's an old tunnel system under the cathedral, Antonio remembered. Prohibition-era construction that connected churches to smuggling networks. Leads to the river, maybe half a mile underground. Marco processed this information with professional interest, despite skepticism about whether escape routes abandoned 80 years ago remained functional enough to provide actual protection during emergency evacuation. But alternatives had been exhausted, leaving desperate measures as only remaining options for preserving lives that criminal competition had marked for elimination. "Sir, I need to tell you something before this ends," Marco said. "Whatever mistakes I made, whatever betrayals I arranged with other families, protecting this child was right decision. Made me remember why I joined your organization originally, because you stood for something more than simple profit, believed that strength should protect weakness instead of exploiting it. The confession represented redemption that extended beyond personal relationships to encompass moral principles that had guided Antonio's early career before competition pressures and survival necessities had corrupted idealistic motivations into strategic brutality. Looking at Lucia's trust, despite everything she'd witnessed, both men recognized that some battles transcended territorial disputes to become struggles for souls that violence typically destroyed before conscience could intervene. Outside, engines roared as assault vehicles positioned themselves for coordinated attack designed to eliminate resistance through overwhelming firepower applied without regard for collateral damage that might affect civilian populations. The wedding ring grew warm against Antonio's skin, heated by proximity to heart that had learned to love again despite decades of accumulated sin. The St. Christopher medal felt cold against Antonio's palm as he pressed it into Lucia's small hand. The patron saint of travelers, worn smooth by his mother's fingers during decades of prayers for her son's safety. Maria Salvatore had given him the medal on his confirmation day, believing that divine protection would guide him away from temptations that consumed young men who grew up in neighborhoods where legitimate opportunities couldn't compete with criminal enterprises. "This will keep you safe when I can't," Antonio said, closing Lucia's fingers around the silver pendant that had survived 30 years of violence without protecting him from choices that had damaged his soul beyond conventional redemption. "My mother wore it every day, prayed for people she loved even when they didn't deserve her prayers." Lucia studied the medal with curiosity that children reserved for objects that adults treated as significant. Though she couldn't understand religious symbolism that connected physical artifacts to spiritual protection, her family had attended church sporadically, cultural Catholics who observed major holidays without developing deep theological understanding that might have provided comfort during traumatic experiences. "Will it bring Benny back?" she asked with innocent hope that adults couldn't share without acknowledging painful reality about death's permanence in a world where violence typically determined outcomes rather than justice or divine intervention. "No, sweetheart, but it will help you remember that love doesn't end when people go away, that someone always cares about you even when you feel alone." Antonio's voice carried gentleness that his criminal associates had never heard, paternal instinct awakened by proximity to innocence that had somehow survived systematic destruction. Outside the cathedral, gunfire erupted as Marco's remaining loyalists engaged assault teams that had been positioned for coordinated elimination of Antonio's organization. The battle would be brief but decisive. Superior numbers and firepower, overwhelming defensive positions that couldn't be maintained against professionally coordinated attack by multiple criminal families, working in unprecedented cooperation. But Antonio's attention remained focused on ensuring Lucia's escape through tunnel system that led from cathedral basement to river access points where Eleanor Rossetti waited with transportation to Wisconsin family that could provide safety his protection had failed to guarantee. The adoption arrangements would proceed regardless of tonight's outcome. Legal paperwork that transferred responsibility for her welfare to people who understood nurturing rather than violence. "I'm scared," Lucia whispered, clutching the medal while sounds of combat filtered through cathedral walls that had provided sanctuary for generations of people seeking refuge from secular authorities who couldn't tolerate spiritual resistance to political control. "Being scared is normal," Antonio replied. "Brave people feel scared too, but they do what's right anyway. Because protecting innocent people is more important than protecting themselves." The lesson represented everything Maria Salvatore had tried to teach him before criminal ambitions. Overwhelmed moral education that emphasized service over self-interest, community welfare over individual advancement. His mother had believed that courage meant accepting personal sacrifice when circumstances required choosing between safety and righteousness. Marco appeared at the tunnel entrance, blood streaming from wounds that hadn't slowed his movement but indicated severity of resistance they were facing from enemies who'd brought military-grade equipment to what amounted to execution rather than traditional criminal competition. His expression carried weight of information that would affect evacuation timing. "Castellanos brought explosives," Marco reported. "They're planning to bring down the building rather than risk extended firefight that might attract federal attention. We have maybe 10 minutes before they detonate charges." The timeline compressed Antonio's remaining opportunities to ensure Lucia reached safety before structural collapse eliminated underground. Escape route that represented their only viable option for avoiding elimination. But 10 minutes also provided opportunity for final conversation that might help her understand why adults had chosen to protect her despite costs that extended beyond simple strategic calculation. "Remember that your family loved you," Antonio said, kneeling to meet her eyes that still held trust despite everything she'd witnessed. "Remember that good people exist even in bad situations, that protecting children is what grown-ups are supposed to do when they're strong enough to fight for people who can't fight for themselves." The St. Christopher Medal warmed in Lucia's grip, heated by proximity to faith that transcended religious doctrine to encompass human capacity for sacrifice that served purposes beyond immediate personal benefit. Outside, violence escalated as Antonio's enemies prepared final assault designed to eliminate resistance through overwhelming force rather than tactical precision. But inside the cathedral, surrounded by sacred symbols that connected present suffering to eternal hope for justice that earthly authorities couldn't provide, Antonio felt something approaching peace. His decision to protect innocence had indeed cost him everything: organization, reputation, life itself. But looking at Lucia's face, seeing trust that no amount of violence could completely destroy, he understood that some prices were worth paying regardless of whether victory seemed possible. The medal caught light from votive candles that still burned despite abandonment, prayers continuing even when worshippers disappeared, from places designed to preserve hope against evidence that suggested despair was more realistic response to systematic cruelty. The new puppy's collar gleamed bright red against golden fur that reminded Lucia of Benny, though this retriever was younger, more energetic, untouched by trauma that had defined her previous pet's final days. The nameplate read "Hope, a choice," made by her adoptive parents, who understood that healing required symbols of possibility, rather than reminders of loss that could prevent emotional recovery. "She likes you already," Sarah Chen said, watching Lucia tentatively stroke the puppy's head while maintaining careful distance that reflected learned wariness about forming attachments that might be destroyed by forces beyond her control. Golden retrievers are loyal companions, gentle with children, protective without being aggressive. The Wisconsin farmhouse felt impossibly peaceful after months of violence that had consumed Chicago's criminal underworld and territorial warfare extending far beyond Antonio's original conflict with Vincent Torino. News reports described systematic elimination of organized crime leadership, federal investigations that had dismantled criminal enterprises through coordinated law enforcement efforts that capitalized on internal conflicts between rival families. David and Sarah Chen had been selected through careful screening process that evaluated their capacity for providing stability to children whose lives had been disrupted by circumstances, requiring specialized understanding and patience. Both teachers, they'd raised 2 adopted children successfully, recognized that trauma survivors needed consistent support rather than dramatic gestures that might overwhelm fragile emotional defenses. "Do you want to help me feed her?" Sarah asked, offering Lucia opportunity for positive interaction that didn't require extensive emotional commitment, until she felt ready for deeper relationship with Pete that represented new beginning rather than replacement. For losses that couldn't be restored, Lucia nodded silently, her communication still limited by protective numbness that worried counselors who understood that grief required expression rather than suppression. Professional therapy sessions had provided safe space for discussing traumatic experiences, but emotional recovery would require time measured in years rather than months. The puppy responded to Lucia's careful attention with enthusiastic affection that ignored her hesitant approach, tail wagging with innocent joy that transcended human complications about trust and vulnerability. Animals possessed capacity for unconditional love that didn't depend on complex negotiations between hope and fear that characterized relationships. Between people who'd been hurt by other people, she's been waiting for someone special to take care of her, David observed from the kitchen doorway. His gentle presence, offering masculine protection that didn't carry threatening undertones, Lucia had learned to associate with adult men. Dogs know when they found the right family. The farmhouse represented everything Antonio had hoped to provide through his sacrifice. Safety that didn't require constant vigilance. Routine that could be predicted without fear of violent interruption. Adults whose strength served protective rather than destructive purposes. Wisconsin's rural landscape offered space for healing that urban environments couldn't provide. "Can I take her outside?" Lucia asked, her first spontaneous question since arriving 3 weeks ago after legal arrangements had been finalized through procedures that concealed her connection to criminal activities while ensuring her adoptive family understood general nature of trauma she'd experienced. The yard stretched across several acres of meadow and woodland that provided natural playground for children and animals who needed room to explore safely. No industrial warehouses, no territorial boundaries marked by violence, no reminders of world where innocence was systematically destroyed by adults who'd forgotten that protecting children was humanity's highest calling. Hope bounded through tall grass with joyful energy that gradually infected Lucia's movements, coaxing smiles that had been absent since Benny's death. The puppy's enthusiasm for simple pleasures, chasing butterflies, investigating interesting scents, rolling in patches of clover, demonstrated that happiness remained possible despite previous experiences with cruelty. Sarah watched from the porch, recognizing signs of emotional thawing that indicated Lucia's psychological defenses were slowly relaxing enough to allow positive experiences to penetrate protective barriers that had been necessary for survival but now hindered recovery. The process couldn't be rushed, but progress was evident in small gestures that suggested healing had begun. "She's starting to trust again," David observed. "Not just the dog, but the possibility that good things can happen without being destroyed by circumstances she can't control." The St. Christopher medal hung around Lucia's neck, visible reminder of promises that had been kept despite costs that extended beyond her understanding. Antonio's sacrifice had indeed ensured her safety, provided opportunities for normal childhood that his world couldn't have sustained, regardless of his protective intentions. Hope's collar jingled as she explored the yard, metallic sound that contrasted sharply with silence that had characterized Lucia's interactions with previous pet whose death had represented final destruction of family happiness. But this puppy belonged to a different story, one where love might survive without requiring violence to preserve it against forces that sought to destroy everything innocent and helpless. The handwritten letter arrived on Lucia's 18th birthday, delivered by Elena Rossetti, who had maintained occasional contact throughout the years to ensure her emotional development progressed normally despite traumatic origins that had shaped her early childhood. The envelope bore no return address, but the careful script matched handwriting Lucia remembered from documents she'd glimpsed during those terrifying days when her world collapsed around her. "He asked me to give this to you when you turned 18, Elena explained, settling into the farmhouse living room that had witnessed Lucia's transformation from traumatized orphan to confident young woman preparing for college studies in veterinary medicine. "Said you'd be old enough then to understand choices that adults make when protecting children becomes more important than protecting themselves." Lucia recognized Antonio's handwriting despite years that had passed since their brief but pivotal encounter, penmanship that remained steady despite circumstances that must have made writing difficult during his final hours. The letter had been sealed for 12 years, waiting for her maturity to develop sufficiently for comprehending moral complexities that had motivated his sacrifice. "Dear Lucia," the letter began, "if you're reading this, Then my promises were kept, and you've grown up safely in a world that couldn't hurt you anymore. I hope you understand that adults who seem frightening sometimes make frightening choices, because protecting innocent people requires courage that looks like cruelty to anyone who doesn't understand. What's at stake? The explanation resonated with understanding Lucia had developed through years of therapy, education, and emotional growth that had transformed her perspective on events that had once seemed random and senseless. Antonio's world had operated according to rules she couldn't have comprehended as child. But adult perspective revealed moral framework that had guided his decisions despite costs that seemed impossible to justify. I never had children of my own who lived long enough for me to protect properly. The letter continued, but meeting you reminded me that some battles are worth fighting even when victory isn't possible. That preserving innocence matters more than preserving life that's been compromised by choices that destroy everything worth protecting. The confession revealed vulnerability that had been hidden beneath criminal reputation built on systematic violence. Acknowledgement that emotional connection had indeed made him weak in ways that competitors could exploit, but strong in ways that transcended strategic calculation about organizational survival or territorial control. Hope lay contentedly beside Lucia's chair, now a mature golden retriever whose presence had facilitated healing that extended beyond simple companionship to represent proof that love could survive without requiring violence, to preserve it against forces that sought to destroy everything innocent and helpless. The dog's grey muzzle testified to years that had passed peacefully in an environment where protection meant nurturing rather than elimination of threats. Your parents were good people who made bad choices because legitimate opportunities couldn't support family they were trying to protect, Antonio had written. They didn't deserve what happened to them, just as you didn't deserve to lose everyone you loved because adults couldn't settle territorial disputes without involving innocent civilians. The acknowledgement of her family's humanity meant more than formal apologies that couldn't restore what had been destroyed. Lucia had struggled for years with questions about whether her parents had been criminals who deserved their fate. Guilt that therapy had gradually replaced with understanding that moral complexity extended beyond simple categories of good and evil. I hope you've learned that strength should protect weakness rather than exploit it. That adults who truly care about children accept personal sacrifice when circumstances require choosing between safety and righteousness. Some prices are worth paying regardless of whether anyone remembers why the payment was necessary. The lesson echoed principles that had guided Lucia's decision to pursue veterinary medicine, career choice motivated by belief that protecting helpless creatures was humanity's most important responsibility. Her academic excellence had earned scholarship opportunities that would enable her to establish practice serving rural communities where economic limitations often prevented proper animal care. Elena watched Lucia fold the letter carefully, preserving words that connected present happiness to sacrifices that had made such peace possible. The social worker had facilitated dozens of adoptions for children orphaned by criminal violence. But Lucia's case remained unique because someone had cared enough to ensure her protection, despite costs that extended far beyond simple strategic calculation. He kept his promise, Lucia said quietly, touching the St. Christopher medal that still hung around her neck after 12 years of providing comfort during difficult moments when memories threatened emotional stability. She'd worked so hard to achieve outside. Wisconsin's countryside stretched beyond horizons that held no threatening shadows, no territorial boundaries marked by violence, no reminders of a world where innocence was systematically destroyed by adults who'd forgotten that protecting children represented humanity's highest calling. But inside her heart, Lucia carried understanding that some people chose righteousness over survival, that love could indeed conquer violence when courage accepted costs that seemed impossible to pay.